This morning, police in Charleston, South Carolina tell NBC News they are aware of the death of a former Boeing employee turned whistleblower.
A second Boeing whistleblower, now dead after experiencing a brief illness. This comes after Joshua Dean expressed concerns
after another string of international safety incidents. On Thursday morning, a Boeing 737-300 passenger aircraft crashed during takeoff in Senegal. 11 people were injured.
Founded on July 15, 1915, for the past 100 years, Boeing has been one of the leading manufacturers in the airline business. The company known for the many airplanes such as the 737, 727, and 777, which are still widely used to this day. If you look at any list of the best-selling planes, you'll definitely see Boeing on there. However, the famous company has landed in some controversy as of recently due to two very serious incidents of whistleblowers dying for the company, dying to very peculiar circumstances after speaking out against the company. What is it that could lead two whistleblowers dying after speaking out, and why has Boeing had such a turbulent few years? Let's take a look into some of the biggest incidents that have occurred within the company, and why have some of these whistleblowers suddenly died after speaking out. Let's take a look together, and perhaps we can come to a conclusion on why this is happening, and there'll be one question that we have on our minds throughout this entire video. What is going on at Boeing?
I know that he did not commit suicide. There's no way.
First tonight, our investigative reporter Ann Emerson has new information in the death of Boeing whistleblower John Barnett. A close family friend of Barnett says he predicted he might wind up dead, that a story could surface that he but he told her, don't believe it.
Our first story is of a man named John Barnett, and he had been with the company for over 30 years and had retired in 2017 as a quality control engineer. According to Cypherion.com, quality control engineers are in charge of ensuring all products in their company meet the set quality standards. Their typical duties include assessing the production process, creating new manufacturing checkpoints, testing the products, and generating reports on the products or results. In 2010, he was employed as the quality manager at Boeing's factory in North Charleston, South Carolina. So he was never just an employee, he was managing quality control, which would give him some insight into the production of the planes that Boeing was working on. Barnett spoke out against the company, which really went into the manufacturing of the planes at Boeing, and as we will look into later. In a New York Times article, Barnett had mentioned that he had discovered clusters of metal slivers hanging over the wiring that commands the flight controls. If the sharp metal pieces produced when fasteners were fitted into nuts penetrate the wires, he said it could be catastrophic. He also filed a whistleblower complaint with regulators. However, he said that he had repeatedly urged his bosses to move the shavings, but they refused and moved him to another part of the plant. So, seeing that he actually brought it up to his upper management and they just moved him, so they're basically saying, you don't have to do anything, you can just go work somewhere else. Ironically, later on, a spokesman for the Federal Aviation Administration, or the FAA, which is in charge for the regulation and oversight of civilian aviation within the U.S., as well as operation and development of the National Space System, Lynn Ludsford, said the agency had inspected several planes certified by Boeing as free such of debris and found the same metal slivers. So we're seeing some consistency with what the FAA found and what Mr. Barnett had been talking about. So this is not just a mere coincidence. With an official investigation, we see that something's not right with this production. So, as we have seen, there is some consistency with what Barnett was talking about and officially what the FAA had found. Some other things mentioned by Barnett was in 2016 when he had learned that a senior manager had pulled a dented hydraulic tube from a scrap bin. This part was part of the central system controlling the plane's movement. The senior manager had mentioned to him, "Don't worry about it," which then he filed a complaint with HR. Keep in mind that he also reported to his management about the defective parts that had gone missing, but he was told to finish the paperwork on the missing parts without figuring out where they had gone. Naturally, this was investigated by the FAA, and it was found out that Boeing had lost some of these damaged parts. The last key thing from this article that I took away was when Barnett was told that he needed to get better at working in the gray areas and help find a way while maintaining compliance. So essentially, every time they brought up a complaint, they would essentially just brush him off every single time. So every time he brought up something valid, like somebody using something out of a scrap bin, it would get brushed aside by the higher ups. Same thing with actual problems like wiring. Of course, naturally, in any form of machinery, if wiring is not working properly, your plane's controls are not going to work. It's pretty much like one-to-one. Your wires don't work, your plane ain't flying properly. So this would be very concerning, because if the stuff's not arranged properly, who knows what kind of stuff could happen. And as we're going to see later on, when stuff isn't working, some of these crashes and some of these accidents can be very, very devastating. But we'll get into that later. Looking at the BBC article, while there was some overlap with what was said in the New York Times article, such as the defective parts going missing and fitting subpar parts onto aircrafts, but some new information that I came across was that there was a serious issue with the oxygen systems. This would result in some of the oxygen masks not working properly, which in a situation where the pressure is off and there's not enough oxygen circulating, there is a chance that a passenger can suffer hypoxia, which is low levels of oxygen in your body tissues. It causes symptoms like confusion, restlessness, difficulty breathing, rapid heart rate, and bluish skin. Lack of oxygen also means people would pass out with a bad oxygen system. Even more interesting is that Barnett had claimed that the 787 showed a 25% fail rate in the emergency oxygen systems, or in other words, 1 in 4 oxygen masks will not work, and that a passenger can potentially suffer from the symptoms that we previously mentioned. And naturally, if you don't have oxygen in the air and you are not unconscious, that is less chance that you could survive and prolong your life, or maybe even survive the situation. So, literally, as we are seeing, Boeing is being rather negligent with their production so far. And just to add insult to injury, Boeing in 2017 had mentioned that identified some oxygen bottles received from the supplier that were not deploying properly. We removed those bottles from production so that no defective bottles were placed on airplanes, and we addressed the matter with our supplier. So they are literally admitting that their oxygen masks are faulty and their systems are not working properly. So this actually shows that what Mr. Barnett was saying had a lot of merit and a lot of weight to it, because first you had the FAA that actually investigated them and found the same stuff that he claimed, and now you have Boeing admitting that their systems are not working. So it's not a coincidence. Leading up until today, Barnett had launched a lawsuit against Boeing with accusations such as defamation of his character and hindering his career due to the safety issues he had mentioned prior, and on March 9th, 2024, he passed away by way of self-deletion in his truck in a Holiday Inn parking lot in Charleston. This naturally raised suspicions because Barnett had to testify on that day, but his legal team could not contact him and he was found dead in his truck. Dying on the day you were supposed to testify doesn't make a lot of sense, especially with the official reports. But we do not know for sure what is actually happened in this moment and what is Boeing's ties to this. But putting 2 and 2 together, that he died on the day he was supposed to testify, does raise a lot of questions. And also, the fact that we've also found some issues in Boeing's production means that there was more that he could have shared, and there's more that he probably knew about, then all of a sudden his life is cut short on the day he's supposed to testify. So a lot of things are not making sense in this part of the story, but as you're going to see later on, there's going to be even more stuff about Boeing and why it's even more suspicious as we look more into it.
Former Boeing employee who went public with safety concerns over the 737 MAX has died. It happened just weeks after another Boeing whistleblower committed. 45-year-old Joshua Dean died Tuesday morning from a severe infection. He had worked as a quality auditor at Spirit Aerosystems, a company that builds parts for Boeing. His attorneys say he was in good health until about 2 weeks ago. Then he was admitted to the hospital with the flu, pneumonia, and MRSA.
Our next story is about a man named Joshua Dean, who was a former quality auditor at the Boeing supplier Spirit Aerosystems, and he had alleged that the higher-ups had been ignoring manufacturing defects on the 747 MAX, as reported by the Seattle Times. On October 2022, Dean said he found a serious defect in the manufacturing, mentioning mechanics improperly drilling holes in the air pressure bulkhead of the MAX. Also mentioned was a separate flaw in the fittings that attached the vertical tail fin to the fuselage. Spirit had fired Dean in April of 2023, and he had filed a complaint with the Department of Labor alleging that his termination was in retaliation for raising concerns related to aviation safety. In a shareholder lawsuit against Spirit in December of 2023, The shareholders had alleged that Spirit concealed from investors that Spirit suffered from widespread and sustained quality failures. Something very crucial that was mentioned in the lawsuit was that such constant quality failures resulted in part from Spirit's culture, which prioritized production numbers and short-term financial outcome over product quality, and Spirit's related failure to hire sufficient personnel to deliver quality products at the rates demanded by Spirit and its customers, including Boeing. The quality failures had been so bad that Boeing put Spirit on probation between 2018 until 2021, which was to make sure that the supplier would be up to standard once the probation was over. Ironically, in August of that same year Dean was fired, Spirit announced that the discovery of improperly drilled holes in the MAX's AFT pressure bulkhead. After discovering this, Dean had filed a safety complaint with the FAA, and he had said that Spirit had used him as a scapegoat and had lied to the FAA about the AFT pressure bulkhead defects. After I was fired, Spirit Aerosystems initially did nothing to inform the FAA and the public about their knowledge of the AFT pressure bulkhead defects. He wrote in his complaint later on in November, the FAA sent Dean a letter stating that it had completed an investigation of the safety issues he had flagged. The investigation determined that your allegations were appropriately addressed under an FAA-approved safety program. The FAA wrote, however, due to the privacy provisions of those programs, specific details cannot be released. So after this was when he filed the complaint to the Department of Labor. On April 30th, Dean had died due to a staph infection that had turned into pneumonia. His aunt Carol Parsons had mentioned that Dean had become sick and went to the hospital 2 weeks prior, and a key detail about Dean was that he was always in good health and was noted for having a healthy lifestyle. So we have someone who lived healthily and it's around 45 years old, which is not really that old in the grand context. The part that had me was his rapid health deterioration, because there are times when your body will deteriorate rapidly, its health. But in this case here, this was after he had spoken out against Spirit Systems, which was also tied to Boeing. So especially with the witness accounts of him being healthy while circumstances happened, it's hard not to notice that this was not long after the first whistleblower had died, and now he had died not long after. And, when we link all these together, it's just interesting to me that every single complaint that's been brought up so far had been investigated or admitted by the company or the FAA. And what ended up happening was, disciplinary action wasn't really taken. So naturally, when it comes to these lawsuits that we've been seeing with Mr. Barnett and Mr. Dean, this shows us that, these companies are not being really held accountable to the standards that we should be holding them, especially when it comes to people flying, because there are 1 million people who are flying a day. And while planes are very safe, and they are actually safer than the cars that you drive on the road every day, it doesn't matter the fact that the safety should be the top priority no matter what. So the fact that Spirit had been focusing on production numbers instead of safety and good working parts just shows that what these whistleblowers were talking about when it came to the companies was they are cutting costs in their production, and we still don't really know the reason as to why they are doing it. But as it is right now, with what we know, they're cutting down production, and they are cutting corners all the way around. So with that being said, we're actually going to segue into some more whistleblowers that actually talked about Boeing and the other type of stuff that they've been saying. So I'm going to let these clips play out, and then we'll talk about some takeaways that we see from, or that we hear from these guys, and then we'll talk about it some more. So without further ado, let's go into Sam Salehpour.
I'm not here today because I want to be here. I'm here today because I felt that I must come forward, because I do not want to see another 787. I do not want to see 787 or 777 crash. I have serious concerns about the safety of the 787 and 777 aircraft, and I'm willing to take on professional risk to talk about them. I have analyzed Boeing's own data to conclude that the company is taking manufacturing shortcuts on the 787 program that may significantly reduce the airplane safety and the life cycle. Since 2013, there have been serious issues on the 787 program, not properly closing thousands of gaps in its assembly of the fuselage on major joints. Boeing's standard says that these gaps must be closed, usually by a small shim or filler called a shim when they exceed 5/1000th of an inch. Details are that the size of a human hair can be a matter of life and death. In a rush to address its bottlenecks in production, Boeing hit problems, pushing pieces together with excessive force to make them appear that the gaps don't exist, even though they exist. The gap didn't actually go away, and this may result in premature fatigue failure. Effectively, they are putting out defective airplanes. I found gaps exceeding the specification that were not properly addressed 98.7% of the time. I want to repeat that. 98.7% of the time, the gaps that they were supposed to be shimmed, they were not shimmed. As a result, I witnessed severe misalignment when the planes were assembled. Boeing manufacturing used unmeasured and unlimited amount of force to correct the misalignment. And this also weakens the airplane in the long run. I literally saw people jumping on the pieces of the airplane to get them to align. I call it the Tarzan effect, among other improper methods. Again, I raised concerns internally. I was sidelined. I was told to shut up. I received physical threats.
So we have some key takeaways that we're going to mention that I picked up on this video was that, since 2013, there has been serious issues on the 787's program not properly closing thousands of gaps in assembly of the major fuselage. And in a rush to address the bottlenecks in production, Boeing hit problems by pushing pieces together with excessive force to make them appear that the gaps don't even exist, though they exist, and the gap doesn't actually go away. Effectively, they are putting out defective airplanes, and this lines up with what Mr. Barnett had been noticing in the production. While this may have been somewhere else, it's seen that around Boeing, they are cutting production again. There is proof, and even this man here has said he had been threatened. And as we noticed beforehand, we have 2 other whistleblowers that had died, and this man is most certainly worried for his safety. So what is this saying? What is Boeing hiding in their production that people come out and automatically they feel threatened about what is going on? They feel threatened about just even talking about it in front of, like this, in this case, in front of the Senate, or just talking about it with news outlets. Hey, make it make sense, because there's a lot in here that doesn't make a lot of sense. And also, one last thing I forgot to mention is that he had actually found gaps exceeding the specification that were not properly addressed in 98.7% of the time. So that means almost all the time, these gaps that were in the plane were not even filled in properly. So this means that the Boeing higher-ups are extremely lazy and are trying to push out a quota. Now, in the real world, naturally, companies have quotas they have to meet, they have production, they have deadlines they have to make. However, what Boeing here has been doing, and on the accounts of 3 different people, they are literally cutting around it so they can just get to the point, whether it's pulling out scrap bins, whether it's improperly drilling, or in this case here, which is probably one of the worst ones, having gaps in between their stuff. And as we're going to look again later on at some of the incidents with these Boeing planes, it actually gets worse. So I have one more whistleblower here by the name of Ed Pearson, who also came out against Boeing in about a 23-minute interview. But there's just one particular clip that I actually want to show you guys from this interview that actually really opens up even more of the conversation into this talk about Boeing.
We've noticed a lot of issues with the planes. I mean, we have had flight management computers repeatedly failing. We've seen stab trim motor failures. I know some of this doesn't make, may not make sense, but these are flight-related safety systems, and these are new airplanes. We have the people, we have the skilled talent and the people, but you can't work them like dogs. You can't give them, unrealistic schedules. You take away quality control inspections, which is ridiculous, especially in light of 2 fatal crashes that killed 346 people. So there's things that you just don't do, and we're doing, and that's why we're not building planes to the quality that we are, we have done historically. And it really is a complete, utter leadership failure right now.
FAA announced an investigation into Boeing. Do you think some of this federal accountability is coming too late? Did they know that there were issues?
The FAA has been absolutely asleep at the wheel. They've had a revolving leadership there, unfortunately, and again, not to critique individual FAA employees, because there's great employees there I've worked with in the past myself, but the leadership has been a mess, and the accountability is bad. You have employees that are asked to do stuff that is not necessarily they're not necessarily the right person to do it. And so, for example, incident reporting, they're supposed to be investigating all these incidents, and just in the last couple, just from memory, we had a United MAX airplane that was at 37,000 feet, and they had an engine failure, and alerts and all that, and the pilot shut it down, came back and landed. That plane was 40 hours old, 40 hours old. We had a Southwest plane that took off at a Phoenix, another MAX plane, not a Dash 9, a Dash 8. As soon as they took off, they didn't have power to the back of the horizontal stabilizer. Pilots couldn't, use the automatic trim. They had to come back and land. That plane was delivered the night before by Boeing. I mean, this is not quality control. Alaska plane descending through 12,000 feet and had icing conditions, and the wing anti-icing system wouldn't work. And if anybody wants to draw, go back and look for yourself and decide, I urge you to go just check it out and look at that report site, and just, you can scroll down and read them. And these things should not be happening to new airplanes.
So some key takeaways that we have also noticed, and some from the full interview as well, is that the FAA has been super slow. All the planes have been defective, and they really should not be happening because these are actually newer models of the planes. All these issues are fixable, and the accountability is bad, which means that the people who are approving this are not being held accountable and rightfully not being fired for their mismanagement. And he also said that the leadership was terrible. He also mentioned stuff along the lines of people who weren't equipped for the job were put in various positions. They got rid of quality control. Like, there's a lot going on, and he especially highlighted that a lot of issues that are going on with these planes behind the scenes are not given to the public, which means that, because even if the wings are not flying properly, the average person can look at that and say, well, we're not flying this plane. We're not flying with this company because they've shown that they are rather incompetent over and over again. So why is it that we have quite a few whistleblowers saying that Boeing is cutting corners? And on top of that, with what Ed Pearson said, we have the FAA that has been slow with their investigation, which is raising more questions of what the hell is going on. Because if the FAA is slow to investigate, and as we have seen prior, they have been finding the same flaws that people have brought up within the company, what could this mean? And how many more planes could be potentially defective that are flying right now? And as we're going to look into later, we have 3 major incidents that we have to look at, because there's going to be some consistency with how these planes were flown and with what went wrong with them. And it's also what I forgot to mention in this clip was the fact that Mr. Pearson had said that the safety control systems, like the flight control systems, were also not working properly and weren't programmed properly. So this also adds to the fact that if the safety functions are not working properly and people are not trained in them, that means that, well, the plane will probably go down and there's not much the pilots can do. So it can be attributed to pilot error, but if the pilot isn't trained on how to fly these systems properly, and if they are trained and these are working properly, they're potentially putting millions of people's lives in danger. So the 3 different incidents we're going to look at is the Lion Air flight of 610 in 2018, the Ethiopian Airlines flight 302 in 2019, and Alaska Airlines flight 1282. And for each of these, I'm simply just going to summarize what happened in each incident and what was the cause of each incident. Lion Air flight JT610 took off from Jakarta's Soekarno-Hatta International Airport at 6:20 a.m. on October 29, 2018. Less than 13 minutes later, it smashed into the sea, unfortunately leaving no survivors. Around a year later, an Indonesian investigation had found out that the crash was doomed from the start due to the aircraft design flaws. Inadequate training and maintenance issues. One of the main criticisms was that the design of the anti-stall system known as MCAS. So I'm quickly just going to explain what the system is, just so that you understand what exactly what it does and how this actually made the flight much worse. So the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, or MCAS, flight control law was designed and certified for the 737 MAX to enhance the pitch stability of the airplane in a very specific set of unusual flight conditions so that it feels and flies like other 737s. MCAS was designed to activate in manual flight with the airplane flaps up at an elevated angle of attack, or AOA. Boeing developed an MCAS software update to provide additional layers of protection if the AOA sensors provided erroneous data. Prior to certification, the software was put through hundreds of hours of analysis, laboratory testing, verification in a simulator, and numerous test flights, as well as validation during in-flight certification tests and Federal Aviation Administration FAA representatives. The additional layers of protection include the flight control system will now compare inputs from both AOA sensors. If the sensors disagree by 5.5 degrees or more with the flaps retracted, MCAS will not activate. An indicator on the flight deck display will alert the pilots. If MCAS is activated in non-normal conditions, it will only provide one input for each elevated AOA event. There are no known or envisioned failure conditions where MCAS will provide multiple inputs. MCAS will never command more stabilizer input than can be counteracted by the flight crew pulling away back in the column. The pilots will continue to always have ability to override MCAS and manually control the airplane. So now we understand how it works. Now, unfortunately, in this report, the aircraft actually had some issues on 4 different flights, which also included one the day before the incident. And even worse, the plane was tested beforehand with flaws pointed out in the MCAS system. However, the 737 MAX was still allowed to fly. Quick editor's note, I want to include the angle of attack that was actually put in the report, just because even though I mentioned it prior, it's actually really important to know how the MCAS really wasn't working properly. And I just want to give a bit more context to that. So here in the official report, it says the airplane's digital flight data recorder, DFDR, recorded a difference between the left and right angle of attack sensors that was present during the accident flight. The left AOA sensor was indicated about 20 degrees higher than the right AOA sensor. During rotation, the left captain's stick shaker activated. The DFDR data showed that the left airspeed altitude values disagreed with and were lower than the corresponding values from the right. The first officer asked a controller to confirm the altitude of the airplane later, and also asked the speed as shown on the controller radar display. After the flaps were fully retracted, a 10-second automatic aircraft nosedive and stabilizer trim input occurred. So essentially, because the system wasn't detecting the angles properly, the plane defaulted to go into a nosedive, which is what the MCAS would actually do in that situation. Just wanted to put that in there. So what are our key takeaways again from this one? Is that the anti-stall system was not working, there were aircraft design flaws and maintenance problems. So this plane, because it had issues prior, it was basically had more chance of failing. And in this case, unfortunately, it failed drastically, which caused no survivors for this incident. And to show you how the gravity of this incident, I'm actually going to show a little animation of how this plane went down, just to give some more weight to the whole incident.
In 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 took off from Jakarta, but for some reason, the plane's nose kept dipping during the ascent. The pilots tried to fight it, but they struggled to maintain altitude. And just 13 minutes after takeoff, the plane crashed into the sea, leaving no survivors. So what went wrong? Well, the plane they were flying was a Boeing 737 MAX, and this plane had a problem. You see, during takeoff,
so as we've seen here, it goes to show that this is how dire the situation was. And because the plane was going so fast into the sea, what happens is that when you have something that's going that fast, water becomes more like concrete. So then, naturally, devastation occurs and the plane just tears up and nobody makes it because it is going too fast into the... Now, we're going to go into Flight 302. And so here, on March 10th, 2019 at 8:38, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 had departed for Addis Ababa Bole International Airport in Ethiopia and was en route towards Jomo Kenyatta International Airport in Kenya. Only a minute after takeoff, the first officer reported a flight control issue. During this flight, the MCAS system had activated, but this prevented the pilots from taking control, which resulted in the plane crashing near the town of Bishoftu. Sadly, there were no survivors again. Looking at the final report of the investigation, it was stated, repetitive and uncommitted airplane nosedive from the MCAS system. Overall, the U.S. team concurs with the EAIB's investigation of the MCAS system and related systems and the role that they played in the accident, appropriate crew management of the event per the procedures that existed at the time would have allowed the crew to recover the airplane even when faced with uncommanded nosedive input. During the accident flight, the flight crew did not make the appropriate use of the associated applicable procedures on which SIC had received training in the preceding months. So, takeaways again, the anti-stall system was still not working, and the second accident forced all 738 MAX 8s to be grounded to not be used for the following feature. So China naturally grounded every single 738 MAX, and other countries had to be grounded just because these incidents were so bad that they had to be, they just had to be grounded. Basically, nobody should be using these planes, and that was the right decision. Of course, naturally, these planes will be back up in the future, but as you know, it was pretty devastating. But before we continue, though, like I said, let's look with the previous plane or accident. I'm going to show you some reports at the time, just to give you an idea of what the gravity of the situation was, or how bad it really was.
Tonight, a startling announcement about the 737 MAX air disaster. Ethiopia's transportation minister declaring the crash shows, quote, a clear similarity with the Lion Air crash in Indonesia in October. This after reviewing preliminary data from the black boxes.
If the Ethiopians know that there are parallels between these two crashes, speed is of the essence. There's no sense in waiting a month. It only endangers the flying public.
ABC News has been told the initial data has not been verified. But data from both incidents right after takeoff showed the planes jolting up and down erratically. Shortly after takeoff, both the Ethiopia and Lion Air flights experienced drops in similar intervals before crashing just after takeoff.
So as you saw in those animations, it's very clear that whenever these pilots got the chance to try and resolve the situation, even going through the procedures, it was not enough time to actually maneuver the plane properly, and this ended up leading to the nosedives that we saw for each of them, which tragically a lot of lives were lost on both of those. And of course, all the planes were grounded after that because Boeing really need to look into their planes and be like, well, we can't. This plane cannot be flying until it has been checked over and over and over again. Now, on to our next flight, which is Flight 1282. On January 5th, Alaska Airlines Flight 1282 was scheduled for a domestic flight from Portland International Airport to Ontario International Airport. Shortly after the plane had taken off, a door plug had came off, which resulted in uncontrolled decompression in the aircraft. This made the aircraft return to Portland for an emergency landing, but this time, everyone survived. However, 3 people had received minor injuries. One passenger had mentioned his experience on the plane and had said, the captain said we had passed 10,000 feet, then the hole blew out on us, and I remember my body getting lifted up. Then my whole body got sucked down by the howling wind. According to the preliminary report, 4 bolts intended to secure the door plug had been missing when the accident occurred, and that Boeing records showed that the plug had been reinstalled with no bolts prior to initial delivery of the aircraft. One key fact that should be mentioned is that the door plug manufactured by Aero Systems in Malaysia on March 24, 2023, and it had arrived, shortly after. So this shows that throughout this whole video, we were talking about Boeing and Spirit Air Systems and then the negligence that happens. And one key thing that I remember from the third whistleblower that was mentioned was stuff was not really put in place properly. And in this case, 4 bolts were not secured into the door plug, which naturally would make it fall off. Now, some takeaways from this was there were reports in the Boeing records that the plug had been installed with no bolts, and Spirit had been the ones to manufacture the doors. And as you would know, one of the whistleblowers, Joshua Dean, worked for Spirit. So we have many different cases of Boeing planes not working properly, and here we are again, where we are at a loss for answers, just because the FAA seems to be rather slow with their investigation, and Boeing seems to still be putting out planes that are very lackluster, to say the least, and prone to many, many problems. Alright, well, this one, like I said, this one wasn't as bad, but like I was saying though, it's just that Boeing's negligence is starting to cost them very, very majorly. And it just goes to show that if anything else went wrong on this flight, instead of just the door coming out, this flight could have actually been way more catastrophic. But luckily, everybody survived on this one. But you're seeing here how badly negligence can go when it comes to manufacturing planes, and Boeing should not be allowed to be doing this. So there needs to be some accountability involved in some of this, because there's no way that a company can just keep getting away with this the entire time. Like, it shouldn't be a thing. And even after grounding their planes, it turns out they're still sending out faulty airlines or faulty airplanes. So just is there so that there's so much in Boeing that needs to change. When it comes to manufacturing, Boeing is cutting corners in the making of their planes, which has resulted in some very major accidents and resulting many people losing their lives. People who speak out against the company seem to die under some very peculiar circumstances, while some others are in fear of their lives. All accounts of the whistleblowers show the consistency that Boeing meshes parts together, does not test their systems properly, or even constructs their planes properly. And now, the biggest question that will remain is, why is Boeing cutting so many corners when it comes to building their planes? But that's a question that I do not have the answers to at this very moment. But what do you guys think about these incidents? Do you believe Boeing is hiding something bigger in their manufacturing? But while you may sit and ponder on these ideas, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you enjoy these type of investigations, because we might do another one in the future. So that's enough out of me for today. So I hope you enjoyed this investigation, and I will see you in the next video. Ciao!